Hey, everybody. Today we have a very special treat. We have the legendary guitarist John Stowell joining us from Portland, Oregon for a little interview. Me and John recently connected online during this quarantine, and he's been incredibly generous with his time and with sharing his knowledge. So we're very lucky to have him here. John, how are you doing today?
Hey, Mike, how are you? A pleasure to be with you. I'm enjoying our collaboration online too. Let's keep going with them.
Absolutely. Can't wait. So I figured a good way to start off with this would be maybe for you to just kind of walk us through some of your earliest memories of the guitar, how you got introduced to the instrument, some of your earliest memories of playing, what kind of music you were into, and so on and so forth.
Sure. My very earliest memories actually started on the ukulele in terms of a stringed instrument given to me by one of my mother's best friends and someone who became my babysitter when I was a little kid. And I'm still in touch with her. She still lives in Connecticut, where I grew up. So she put a ukulele in my lap probably when I was 8 or 9 and gave me a few basic chords. And I think I got my first acoustic guitar when I was about 10. And by the time I was 13 or 14, I probably had my first electric, initially playing in some rock bands around Southern Connecticut, and then was introduced to jazz, listening to it probably in my late teens. And the jazz that pulled a lot of us in who came from a rock background was some of the earliest fusion jazz from people like Miles Davis, Weather Report, and so forth. So I kind of gradually worked my way into jazz, but probably the first 10 years of my musical life were not playing jazz at all.
So when you started out with some of the rock stuff, who were some of the bands and guitarists that you were into at that time?
Oh, I remember really liking early Yardbirds with people like Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, some of those folks. And then I got interested in some of the sort of extended jam band folks like the Grateful Dead and some of the other groups I remember listening to. Then Moby Grape I enjoyed. I thought they were a nice band. So some of these bands were mixing sort of rock, sort of jazz influence, long improvisations with folk. And then some of these folks also had some classical influences. So music was pretty eclectic then. You could really get a sampling of a lot of different styles, even hearing one band play. And then I found myself having spent a little time with fusion jazz, and I really started studying music and then worked my way back into some of the earlier jazz of the maybe mid '60s, and then on back from there. So my chronological approach to the music was a little bit scattered. I just kind of found music as I was introduced to it, and then found my way sampling from all the different genres of jazz.
So basically, you started out with rock and then got into fusion, and through fusion, was that kind of like a gateway into learning more of the jazz stuff?
Exactly, and that was true for a lot of musicians my age coming up in the late '60s, early '70s.
Who were some of your favorite fusion guys at that time?
Oh, I really liked, and I still like some of Bitches Brew, that record that Miles put together about 1970, 71. Kind of an extended jam with a really large group, in some cases, 2 or 3 electric keyboards, electric bass, acoustic bass, guitar, bass clarinet, soprano, sometimes 2 drummers. So it was very loose, very open-ended jamming, but some of the music is wonderful in that record, and I still like it. I like early Weather Report. I liked some of the other groups from that era. Some of what Chicory did, I really enjoyed. Slightly later on, in terms of fusion, and some of what Alan Holdsworth did, I think is still pretty stunning, especially his use of chords. So, and then as I said, as I was getting more into the music, I was just picking and choosing from lots of different eras of the music. And now, actually, even going back to some of the music of the late 1930s, early 40s, I was in a car with some friends in Vienna last fall, and we were listening to 2 hours of Coleman Hawkins. I thought, boy, this music sounds incredible. And so I tell younger musicians, be open-minded and try to sample a bit from all the various eras of the music, because there's something to learn from every single one.
Absolutely. That's awesome. So was there like a specific moment where you had decided that you wanted to pursue jazz and pursue a career in playing jazz?
Good question. Not really. I mean, I knew that I loved the music, and again, not having any real natural talent or affinity for it, definitely not making a living at it. But I found myself drawn to the music, and then slowly, as I mentioned, studying. I studied actually with two musicians who were very helpful to me in Southern Connecticut, John Mehegan, who had written some of the earliest theory books on jazz, who had come up in New York in the late '50s, early '60s, and had moved out to Connecticut when I met him in the early '70s. And he had a little weekend gig in Westport, Connecticut, where I used to go sit in for free every weekend. And that was a great training ground for just learning standards and learning some of the harmony. And I also took a few lessons with him. And then my guitar teacher was a man named Link Chamberlain, who unfortunately, he died young in his 40s in the mid 1980s, but had a great teaching practice for probably 20 years. So he didn't tour much, but he was very helpful. And a lot of the things that I use in my own teaching, I got from him, and I still credit him. His approach to the modes and some of his ideas about chords. He was very supportive, very helpful, and always encourage you to try to find your own voice, which is something I try to pass along to anyone I'm teaching. Give someone the information, show them how you use it, and by all means, encourage them to transcribe and listen to others to get some vocabulary, but ultimately to try to find their own voice. And I definitely hear that in your playing.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot coming from you. So thank you. So did you go to school for music as well, or did you just learn from studying privately and on the gigs?
No, it was just private study and the gigs. I mean, I think really an academic background is useful if you want to teach at a higher level, even high school level these days, but certainly junior college, community college level teaching, you have to have a master's, in some cases now a PhD. So some folks decide they want to have an academic career, and then the diplomas, the degrees are absolutely necessary. You cannot teach otherwise. Although I've done quite a bit of adjunct teaching because I don't have a degree. I didn't go to music school. So I would think that you can really become a good journeyman player and also maybe a decent journeyman teacher just by trial and error. That's how I learned. And I'm not sure that going to school makes you a better musician than just studying privately and going to do lots of gigs and learning on the job. But the academic background is useful not only for the degree to allow you to have an academic career, but you also have a chance to network and to connect with some of your peers who you can ultimately play with and create connections with after you graduate. So a lot of folks have said that their academic background has been good for this reason as well, helping them put a network in place. So if I'm ever at a college doing a workshop, I always tell the folks there, please think about beginning to establish your network while you're all in school here together. And many of you will leave the town where the college is and go elsewhere. So that gives you an opportunity to create some work in other places, to do small tours or even extended tours, which is what I do a lot of the time. Hopefully I'll be able to get back to. But I do that without a manager, without any real international reputation to the extent of some of the famous folks. But it is still possible to have lots of nice little grassroots touring experiences like I've had if you have a network in place of folks that can help you with workshops and gigs. So the academic experience is good for that reason also.
So I know you were telling me that at a certain point you decided to settle down in Portland, Oregon. So did you originally establish a network in Connecticut and New York and then start over again in Portland, or did you kind of initially get your connections in Portland, Oregon?
Yeah, I moved down near New York. And the reason I'm in Portland, Oregon was because in 1976, the little club that I used to sit in the village, I go down sometimes 3 or 4 nights a week and just sit in for free with some of the piano bass duos there. And a man came in one night named David Friesen, who's a bassist who lives in Portland, Oregon. And I'd never been to Oregon. I'd only been out to the West Coast once before, about 5 years earlier. I didn't know the West at all. And we sat in together and became friends and began playing together a little bit locally. I was just starting to establish a small network. At that point, when I met him, I was doing a little teaching at a small classical conservatory that added some jazz into their curriculum in White Plains, New York, still there, Westchester Conservatory. Oh. And so I was teaching for a living, making a modest living teaching and playing some little gigs. I wouldn't say it was any kind of a network that would allow me to tour because they were all people just that lived in the area where I was, around the New York area. So I went out with David for what was going to be a 3-week visit after we had become friends and played a little bit around the Westchester, New York area. And I ended up staying all summer because he found a lot of little gigs for us to do. And then I went back to New York with him because he had a record to do. And at that point, I knew all of his original material, so he was able to get me on the album. It was with Paul McCandless and Steve Gadd, pretty nice group, playing David's material. This was in 76 for a small label called Inner City. We ended up doing some other recordings for them as well. So I had still at this point no plans to live in Portland, Oregon. I'd never been to Oregon before this one visit with David, but it felt like our musical relationship could go on for a while. So I subletted my apartment in New York, and I kept it for a couple of summers because we were back for the summers of 77 and 78, and then I let it go. So I've been based in Oregon ever since, and I started touring with David. So that's when my little touring network actually started to fall into place through him. And he was doing all the booking while we were traveling together, but I was obviously meeting the people that we were doing workshops and gigs for. So around 1983, after about 7 years of doing these small tours with him, we were kind of moving in different directions musically. So it was just kind of a friendly parting of the ways. It felt like an organic separation. There was no recrimination, no bad feelings at all. So at that point, having done these little tours with him for about 7 or 8 years, I knew people in quite a few places. Some West Coast, some East Coast, and a few out of the country. So I was just curious. At that point, I'd had some I felt like I was kind of a reasonably experienced traveler on the road, having done all this with him, but I'd never tried it on my own, so I had no idea if I could do it. But I wanted to see if I could. So I've just continued on that path ever since. So in the last probably 15 years, it's been between, I would say, 7 and 8 or 9 months of the year traveling, really at the most grassroots level. I'm basically staying with friends most of the time and working with the people where I'm going. So they actually do the booking for the most part if I'm out of the country anyway,
Oh, nice.
or in a place that I don't know. So these are people that I enjoy playing with and I enjoy staying with. So you want to be a good guest and take your host out to dinner and try not to impose on folks, because basically I'm really not making enough money to afford 260 nights of the year in hotels. I would lose money. It's just a few good paychecks in the year and lots of little things. But I really enjoyed the variety of being able to travel. I've been in about 20 countries now. So basically, it's all with a network of friends. So I tell any aspiring musicians who would like to tour, really all it takes is having a small network to begin with, and just knowing somebody who lives in another place and you being willing to go there to establish a relationship. And typically, you will find out about more contacts by going there than you would if you were just trying to do it from home. So if I show up someplace, I'm probably going to come back with a few new contacts that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. And I like showing up in these different places. I mean, playing for different audiences with different musicians. And if you're going to other countries, getting a worldview, kind of opening yourself up to different perspectives. I have found all of that really very, very enlightening. And for the most part, I'd say 97% of my experiences on the road have been positive. You get the odd challenge with travel arrangements and a misconnection, or something happens with a gig cancellation. That's just normal. But I'd say overwhelmingly positive experiences of, looking back on 40 years of doing this.
That's awesome. And I think that would be a good segue into a couple of things I wanted to ask you just regarding touring and playing with different musicians, because you've had a pretty extensive career of playing with a lot of different people. So I was wondering if I could just name a person that you've played with, and if you have any interesting stories to share, any cool things that you learned through playing with them that you'd be willing to share with us. Is that okay?
Sure. Go ahead.
Cool. So I figured the best person to start with would be Milt Jackson.
Okay, that was one gig, but it was fun, and there was something I can share with you about that gig. First of all, he was extremely gracious. He was traveling as a single. The MJQ Modern Jazz Quartet was still playing, and he was out on a little tour by himself. So he came to Portland, Oregon. He didn't have a clue who we were, and we put together a group with guitar, bass, and drums. My friend David Friesen, the man that I came out to Portland with, a drummer named Mel Brown, who was a very seasoned player, everything from Motown and Diana Ross to all kinds of jazz gigs. I would say Mel was probably the most seasoned player besides Milt in the group. I was the youngest and the least experienced, but I had been playing long enough that I could certainly get through a set of changes and knew some standards. And Milt obviously had the most experience by far. He'd been on the scene at that point probably for 40 years and stellar reputation, one of the most important modern vibes players in jazz. So he showed up, and not a trace of attitude. The nicest man in the world. He said, let's just play some tunes. We don't need to rehearse, and let's just get a sound check. And he wanted to make sure he had all our first and last names correctly pronounced so that he could introduce us. So I looked at this man who had so much experience and showing up in Portland, Oregon, not knowing us, immediately set us at our ease, treated us with courtesy and respect, and the gig was fun and easy. And I have no memory of what it sounded like now. I think we did well enough. He didn't seem upset or bothered by anything. So I've had a few of those experiences in the past. And what I took from that was that if you are the experienced player in the group, I think the way to have everyone else in the band feel relaxed and at ease is just to immediately be friendly, maybe have some suggestions about how the evening should go if you're the leader, but don't do it in a way that feels overbearing. You don't want folks to feel uptight or concerned about anything. And the audience sees the joy that you're making in the music together, and they, especially if they know if you're an experienced leader showing up and the other folks in the band are not as well known or not as experienced, I think the audience enjoys seeing you putting them at ease. And in some cases, many people in the audience are friends of the folks in the group if it's a local band. And I think that just makes everyone feel great. So my goal, whoever I'm playing with, and I think Bill certainly had this feeling for that gig, just make it an experience of joy and sharing, and that communicates. That feeling is communicated amongst the musicians on the bandstand. That feeling then comes out to the audience, and they bring it back to us. And then it's the nice experience for everybody, and that's what the music should be. So that was my little lesson from my one night with Milt Jackson, for sure.
That's awesome. That's really cool. So how about Art Farmer?
One gig also.
That's fine.
Interesting. Also
you
through
plenty
my
of
friend
good stuff
David
to say
Friesen.
about Milt.
Yeah. But I can also put that on the resume. If you play with somebody once, I say to them, I mean, at one time I sat in with Elvin Jones for 3 tunes at a festival. 3 tunes doesn't really
Wow.
count. So I haven't put Elvin on my resume for that reason. But the one gig with Art Farmer, it was a gig, so I put him on the resume. So same situation. He came in as a single, and this was early 80s. And he said, the last time I was in Portland, Oregon was 1953. So he hadn't been in Portland in about 30 years. So same thing. He came in, he actually had a book of tunes, but all the charts were very well prepared, easy to play. I think I sort of surprised him initially because he just didn't know what I sounded like or who I was, and kind of took him aback a little, but then he sort of relaxed. He said, at first I was kind of in shock. And he just hadn't heard me before and didn't know what I sounded like. But then he kind of relaxed and we played beautifully. And, I had done my homework, obviously, and told him I really enjoyed the records he'd done with Jim Hall. They had a working group in the 60s.
Oh, yeah.
So even though I was still relatively young at that point, I was maybe your age or a bit younger, he could tell that I had done my homework and I was trying to do a decent job. So same bassist, David Friesen, I think the same drummer, Mel Brown, but we added piano for that particular gig, a man named Eddie Weed, who was a very seasoned player and a nice man. And same thing, Art was relaxed, friendly, comfortable, not overbearing at all, very accommodating. So very much like Milt. I mean, they're from the same generation. And I think, the lessons that you learned coming up in terms of how you want to kind of comport yourself as a leader on the stand and how you want people to feel. And they both probably had, I would imagine, dozens of years playing as a single in addition to leading their own bands. So you develop a strategy to immediately go in with a group that you never played with before and find the tunes that are realistic for everyone to play comfortably and just try to make the very best evening of it. And Art was exactly the same way.
Nice. That's awesome. So the next person I want to ask you about, I particularly appreciate as a big fan of Ed Bickert. So you've played with Don Thompson?
I have. And Ed, I met a few times, but I never had the pleasure of playing with Ed. He just left us in his late 80s, unfortunately.
Yeah,
One
unfortunately.
of my very favorite guitar players. And Don I met, I think I initially met Don. This is a funny story, actually. I wasn't on this gig. But Don and Terry Clark, Don just had his 80th birthday. I haven't talked to him in a while. I'd love to talk to him. We've done a few gigs that I'll tell you about. But one of the first times I met Don, he had come to Portland. This is also early 80s, in the trio with Jim Hall's trio with Terry Clark and Don. They played beautifully. But sometime earlier in that tour, Terry had slipped and fallen on some ice in the Midwest, and his left arm was in a sling. He set up the full drum set and played the whole gig with both feet and his right hand only. And honestly, after the first tune, I didn't really notice. And they were giving him solos and fours and eights and everything else. Terry's an incredible drummer. I had a chance to do one gig actually with Don and Terry both. I was pleased that I got a chance to play with that stellar rhythm section of Jim's. So I think the first time I actually played with Don, we were both teaching up in Banff, which is a learning center in Western Canada that has done a jazz workshop for about 30 years. And one year I was there for about 10 days filling in for Mike Stern, who couldn't make it on short notice. And the faculty that year was Don, Dave Liebman, Kenny Werner, he was the director that year, Keith Copeland, who else? Some other folks, but a great faculty. So Don and I were just hanging out one of the evenings before we started teaching, and he said, "Oh, we can record here." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, there's a studio here that they use to train engineers, and if you're either faculty or student in the jazz workshop, you just sign up with one of the student engineers in training, and they're very capable. I've been there before. This is Don talking, and we'd have a good time." And Dave Liebman is standing nearby. And I had known Dave at that point for more than 20 years because he used to play with Link Chamberlain. That's how I met Dave. And Dave said, "Oh, I'll show up too." So no time to rehearse. We were busy teaching all week. And so we showed up at the appointed time for the recording. The engineer was very nice. He was capable. And no Dave. So I just figured he got busy. So Don and I started playing. And then Dave showed up in the middle. So that eventually became a record for my friend on the Origin label called the Banff Sessions. Dave's on the 3 tunes that he had time to show up for. And then Don and I played the rest. And then Don and I have done probably another maybe 3 or 4 gigs in Toronto. He and Terry Clark are both from Vancouver, BC, west coast of Canada, but they've both been in Toronto for many years. And so Don booked, when I was nearby, Don booked a few gigs for us at some little clubs in Toronto, and they were an absolute pleasure. And Don is, by the way, first call on upright bass, piano, and vibes. And I think he plays some other instruments as well. And he's just equally good on all 3. And a stellar musician. I think he's still active. And I owe him a phone call. I haven't spoken to him in quite a while. But a stellar musician. And he used to play with George Shearing as well, where they do bass and piano duos, and then they do 2 pianos. So Don can really hold his own with George Shearing on the piano. He's a stellar musician. And he's also quite a good arranger.
I remember the first time I heard him play piano was on that Jim Hall album Circles, I believe it's called.
Yep.
And it has that
Yep.
opening track and there's this crazy piano. So I was like, who's this piano player? And I look at the, the liner notes and it says Don Thompson, bass and piano. I had no idea. But yeah, he
Yeah.
is an incredible musician.
And he's just as good on vibes.
Wow.
Yeah, he's a stellar musician. I mean, there's some excellent Canadian musicians. I've done some of the festivals in probably, I don't know, maybe 6 of the Canadian cities. And I've played in some other cities. So I know many Canadian musicians. There are some stellar world-class Canadian jazz musicians. And a really nice festival circuit in the summer too. They're always fun. I mean, the volunteers who work the festivals are great. They're there because they love the music. So they really treat you well and make sure you get where you're going. And things are well promoted and generally very well run. I'm supposed to maybe try to go back to the one in Edmonton this year, but because of the virus situation, I'm not able to. But I think maybe next year. Last time I played that festival was 10 years ago, but I know the man who books it. So I think there's maybe a chance to get back next year. But the festivals are always fun.
What kind of group were you planning on going with this upcoming time?
I generally go to the festivals alone because I don't have the reputation to really bring a group with me and demand that kind of a budget if I'm bringing people with me. But thankfully, I've been traveling long enough that I have good musician friends in all the different places that I can go. So I can. One of the ways I sell myself is as a cheap date. I'm not playing the big main venues. I'm usually playing a club or a smaller venue, which is fine. That's my drawing power. If I can get 50 or 100 people to show up to hear me, I'm thrilled. Very often it's smaller audiences. But I can assemble a good group just about anywhere I'm going, no problem. And I don't have to say to a festival promoter, well, I need $2,000 or $3,000. I can say, what have you got? And we'll try to make it work.
Right. And all that comes back to what you were saying before about building the networks. You've gotten to a point where you have those networks scattered throughout the United States and Canada, and I'm sure in Europe as well. So if you go there, you have the ability to just, have musicians that you know of in the areas that you can call to play with.
Exactly. So I've done that now many times in Argentina, all over Europe. I'm doing a bit in Asia now. I was there for about a year ago, and I think I'll go back maybe next year. And basically, I tell any musician, you can really do this on your own grassroots if you can handle all the details of traveling and understand that booking these tours is really a salesman's job. It's a salesman's mentality, meaning just get on that computer more than the phone these days. It's easier, thankfully, with emails. And just before we had email, it was harder because then you're dealing with time zones and large phone bills. So it's quite a bit easier now.
Oh, wow.
So I'm working on that computer every day. And now, given the fact that I have no tours and no gigs like everybody else, and you're doing the same thing, I'm just trying to build up my online presence with trying to get my YouTube channel up. I've got a long way to go before I catch up to you, my friend, but I'm working on it. And more online teaching. I'm trying to do more. Hey, I appreciate that. But I think going forward, even if I'm able to get back out on the road again the way I was, and I hope I'll be able to, I think I'm going to have a more active life online as well. You're doing more of what you're doing. Just send them to your YouTube channel or your website. They see everything there. And as you know, it's all about linking all the social media together with websites, creating new content, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm creating some new content for my YouTube channel. So I've just been filming some things here at home. We put up one last week and, I got about 400 or 500 views and 40 new subscribers, bumped right up. So I'm not sure that's going to happen every time I post, but I'll post something new with my help of my buddy in Germany who's helping me with social media, Sebastian. We'll probably post something weekly, one something. And we'll see, I may not get that kind of a bump every time I post something new, but I'm going to keep going with it. I'm sure you have strategies about how you build up your channel too.
Yeah, it's hit or miss. And we've talked a little bit about this before. I think the main thing I try to do is just keep putting out content, sometimes you'll get a nice little bump. Sometimes it's a little disappointing, but I think just the act of consistently putting out stuff, it can't hurt in any way. I mean, I made that lick of the week video of you and then we ended up hooking up because of that. So it's like, it's so unpredictable to see what happens. So my whole thing is just keep doing it and things will eventually come out of it no matter what. So
I would also give yourself a little credit because what drew me to contact you in the first place was how well you presented everything. I could tell clearly you're a good guitarist and also a good teacher. So I thought I should just reach out and say thanks. And that started the wheels turning because I'd also approached some other guitar players about these collaborations, which is a way to offer a slightly different lesson format than just you alone. And I will follow up for us for the ones I've submitted already. But I think in any case, we should keep creating this content and we'll be able to throw it up somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And when I got that message from you, I thought I was seeing things at first. I was like, did John Stoll just send me a message? That's crazy. So I'm very, very honored to be doing this with you. So thank you.
Hey, we're having fun. And I can tell you for sure that I feel every bit the student that you do, in the sense that there's always plenty to learn. And I think if I'm lucky, my best playing's still ahead of me. It's definitely ahead of you. But I've got friends in their late 80s, as I think I mentioned in one of our earlier sessions, like John Pisano, who's 89 years old. He's still playing and teaching and playing well, and still in love with trying to be a better guitar player at 89. God bless him.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a never-ending process. That's why I never understand
That's
when
right.
people say they're bored. It's like if you're a musician, it's pretty hard to be bored. There's always something to
Mm.
learn, you know?
Yeah, I've been dusting off some old Ted Green books, and I've got a lot of
Oh
things that
God.
I mean, it's just any one page of Ted Green. I found a couple of new voicings I'll show you that are pretty interesting.
Yeah,
And
I'd
then
love.
with the trick with chords, as you know, is then putting them in a context so that you don't forget them and then
Right.
make them part of your vocabulary. But the neck is this little puzzle that we spend our lifetimes trying to unlock, and it's such a beautiful little puzzle to try to decipher, as you know.
And that's what's cool about making the videos too, because it's almost like a refresher for certain things. If you're working on something or you want to present something and then you kind of take a break from it for a while, going back to those videos can be a great resource even for yourself, you know, at least for me.
I
Um,
agree. Yeah, I mean, as you know, one of the best ways to become a better player is to teach what you're learning or what you know already to somebody else. And very often by demonstrating, you find a new little window into an opportunity for yourself to find something you have to work on with that, which is one of the reasons why it's great fun to teach.
yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I have two other people I wanted to ask you about that you've played with. So we'll
Okay,
stick to the guitarists for now. So you've played with Herb Ellis.
I did. He was a funny man. I do have a couple of stories about Herb. We may have only done one gig, and then we did a few workshops together. He was a very nice man, very unassuming, and we were really different players. But I think he was open-minded and open to playing with it. He played with lots of different guitar players and the great guitars, and probably lots of other settings too. So he was open to playing with other guitar players, and even though he had a very particular style, which I liked a lot, he was open to playing with other folks. I think he found some of my chord voicings interesting, and he could see I was trying to do something different. So the one actual gig we did was in Portland. He also came through as a single, and it was the same club that I had played with Art Farmer. Actually, it was a fairly well-known club in Portland that was beginning to bring some national acts in. So I was going to pick him up in the hotel lobby in downtown Portland, bring him over to the club. So he comes down into the lobby, and he's got his 175. This is before Gibson made the 165 model for him, which kind of looked like a 175. And he had his guitar in a green garbage bag with the neck sticking out. This is February in Portland, and it's not as cold as Connecticut, but it can be kind of cold and rainy. So I said, Herb, where's your case? And he said, no, I don't need the case for the gig. I'll just wipe this off when I get to the club. This is lighter. So he just threw the guitar in the back seat in the garbage bag, and we get to the gig, takes the towel, wipes it down. Sure enough, he's ready to go. Pretty funny. But, he was a generous guy. He was very happy to, a little like Art and Milt in the sense that he just wanted to play some tunes and have fun. He did have a book, but there were tunes that were just standards. They were not difficult to play. They were all fun. I mean, certainly he was in groups that had arrangements like the Oscar Peterson Trio and the great guitarists. Those were more arranged formats, but he was also perfectly happy just to go out as a single and play tunes with you. And he was the same thing. He was generous. He was relaxed. He gave everybody plenty of solo space. He was made sure that everyone was introduced properly. And I thought he was a generous man. I liked him.
That's great. It's always nice hearing this about guys because I think a lot of guys, you know, you really admire their playing, but then you never really know what they're like as a person. So finding out stuff like that is always for me, it's just really nice to hear that about people that I admire,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Mm-hmm. I would say, in general, most of the jazz musicians I've met are down to earth, supportive, friendly, because they know it's hard to try to make a living playing this music, and we all do it because we love it. And they understand this. Some of the really famous folks have bigger egos, some. But I'd say, in general, most jazz musicians are approachable, very nice, supportive, happy to try to help.
Yeah, that's great. And then the last person that I wanted to ask you about was Tom Harrell.
Okay, I have a few stories about Tom. I haven't seen him in many years. The last time I played with him actually was '93. But I did a few gigs with him in the early '70s before I came out to Portland. He was playing already well then. I think at that point he'd already played with Horace Silver and come up with a bunch of bands. Very distinctive style. And my friend David Friesen, on maybe the last record I did with David, used Tom. We did do any gigs with David and Tom, but Tom played beautifully on that record. And David's music was a bit challenging in the sense that it's not typical diatonic harmony, but Tom was more than up to the task. He did beautifully. So I hadn't seen him probably since then, since '83. And then in '93, yes, in the summer of '93, I had a little tour in Europe, which turned out actually to be about 6 weeks. I was able to put three things together. And I had a friend who was booking a small club in the basement of a hotel in Paris. And I hadn't actually worked for him, but he and I had been in touch. And he said, "Oh, Tom Harrell is coming as a single. Would you like to play with him?" And I said, "Of course, if Tom would be consider doing it, I'd be happy to." So Tom remembered me, but we hadn't done any gigs together. We just done that one recording, and then that's not quite true. We'd done a few gigs in the early '70s, but I hadn't played with him in 20 years, and we'd done the one recording in '83. So it was a very good French bassist, me and Tom, so kind of a little chamber group, just the three of us in this small basement club, packed every night. And one night, Lester Bowie came in from Chicago Art Ensemble, sat right at the front table, and I thought, boy, he sounds so different from Tom, and he loved the music and super friendly, kind to Tom, very supportive. And so we did a week, and Tom couldn't have been nicer. And we played some of his tunes, some of which I still have the charts for. He's quite a good composer. So over the years, I've played Scene is a really pretty waltz of his, and also what's the other? There's a long form bossa nova. I'll think of it in a minute. Quite nice. But he's a very good composer, and I think he's still quite active. And he thankfully has a really supportive wife because he's dealt with some physical issues over the years that have made it challenging for him to tour. But I think, music has really helped him to maintain his equilibrium. And his wife, I think, has been super supportive and helpful. She's a documentary filmmaker. I met her that one time we were in Paris 25 years ago. More than that now. It was 93. But that gig was fun. And he was, I think he also, having played with Jim Hall, he liked sort of the dialogue, especially in the chamber group without drums, just with the three of us for that week together. It really was fun.
So with a lot of these gigs, like a lot of these people that we mentioned and a lot of the stuff that you do on your own, are you typically showing up at a place that you're being hired to play with, or you're going to a place and you're hiring someone? Like, are you not typically like on the road with a lot of these guys a lot of the times?
I'm almost never on the road with anybody else, Mike, because I just don't have the reputation to pay my friends the salaries that they deserve. So if I can say to, I can think of probably 15 friends. If I said, how's $1,200 a week plus your expenses? Everyone would say, yeah, let's go. I would need to pay them a lot, but that means it increases the difficulties and the number of details exponentially if you're talking about accommodations, because I can't expect someone to put up a band. I can expect a friend to put me up, maybe if there's a couch or a guest room. That's fine. Usually that works well. But if it's two or three of us, almost impossible. I've done a little bit of duo touring with my vocalist friend Kendra Shank, who lives in New York. And we've done a bit of touring up and down the West Coast together in my car, staying with friends or some of her friends. And I have gone on the road a few times. I would love to be able to take a band on the road, but not that many people are touring with groups these days for this reason, just because it's so labor intensive. And people are not unreasonable. They just need to make a little money, obviously. And I would want to compensate my friends fairly, So there are a couple of bands I'd love to take out on the road. Maybe it'd be possible. If you can get one good anchor date that covers the plane, or if you're driving enough to maybe make a long drive, and then it's fine to fill in other small things because you might keep playing, but you can't go out for 4 or 5 small gigs and lose money and expect people to go with you. It's not realistic. And most of my friends have responsibilities and reasonable careers where they are, or in terms of what they're doing. So I'd ask them to put things on hold or go out with me for even a few dates, but it's not realistic. So I wouldn't rule it out for the future of something. I have done a few tours with friends, and I've been on a few tours that friends have had me on. But typically, I usually go by myself and then work with the people where I'm going. And those people very often are friends who also are willing to put me up in addition to booking the gigs for us. So like I said, it's the very lowest rung of the ladder in terms of a touring musician, very grassroots, and it's mostly small venues, even as small as house concerts. And I talked about that, playing in somebody's living room. And if it's 5 people on a couch, it's still fun because they're all listening and you're still making something. And occasionally you get lucky and it's 20 or 30 people. I did one in Austin, Texas with a very good singer friend of mine, Susie Stern. And we had this place packed to the rafters, maybe 40, 50 people. And I made about $400, $400 or $500.
Nice.
That's not typical for a house concert. But I've had many nights that have been $150, $200 playing a couple of sets in someone's living room. It's a beautiful experience. More people are stepping up to do this because the club scene is what it is. Clubs come and go, and very often the money or the listening environment is not ideal. I'll still do those gigs, but I'm liking this idea of doing the more intimate concerts in somebody's home. I think it's fun.
Yeah, I feel like that's going to start happening
I can
more
to keep
now
it
with
going.
this virus.
Yeah, I think small gatherings hopefully will be happening before the end of the year, socially distanced. So people might be comfortable having 10 or a dozen people in their living room if maybe we're all wearing masks and sitting 6 feet apart.
Right.
So I would hope that we're able to have a chance to play for small audiences before the end of the year. I hope so.
Right. You're seeing a lot of weird new stuff start happening too. Like people are doing like virtual concerts and giving their PayPal link or their Venmo, and people are sending them money, which is something that I've never really experienced at all. So I'm wondering if this is going to be a period that kind of rewires the way some people think about some of this stuff and hopefully makes some changes for the better. I mean, it's hard to tell so far, but I'm hoping that's what the turnout ends up being.
I think when we get back out to playing live, like I said, we can still keep this online component as a part of our musical lives. So I just did one about 10 days ago, actually. We did it on Facebook Live, and I had a friend help me promote it. And we had about, I think the most I had attending, I played for probably, I don't know, 75 minutes. I think the most people we had attending at any given moment was about 130. And people can type in little messages, so I could see the time zone was such that we could do East Coast, a little late for the rather West Coast. A few people stayed up on the East Coast, but it was a little late for that. We're going to push it maybe an hour earlier. But all my Asian friends came on, and a few people from South America, and I made the equivalent of you do put up a PayPal link so people can donate, but there's no fixed. It's not like a cover charge. People can donate $3, or one friend sent me a $50 check in the mail. I couldn't believe it. But I made a couple $100 sitting in my little living room here, and so I'll do more. I mean, you don't want to overexpose yourself. Some folks are posting every day 1 or 2 tunes and then saying just contribute whatever you want, and maybe they have success with that if they're well known. But I think I'll maybe keep it to 1 or 2 a month only, and try to think about not repeating myself too much with the same repertoire. And maybe the next time I do it, 5 people will show up. I have no idea, but I want to keep doing it. And a friend is also hosting some virtual workshops. I did one of those, small turnout, but we're going to try another one at the end of the month. So everybody is thinking about just different ways to expand their presence online, obviously. And that could be all those things, workshops, concerts, whatever
Right.
you can do, lessons, obviously. You're doing that already. So.
Yeah, and I feel like with you too, a lot of it is more so just people being aware of the fact that you're doing these things, like the fact that you're doing a YouTube channel now, just by telling people that, and me telling my jazz friends and stuff like that, I know they'll go over and subscribe because they know you and they love your playing. I think it's just more a matter of the awareness continuing to spread more and more, and people knowing that these things are going on.
Yeah, and we can help each other. So certainly subscribing
Mhm.
to each other's channels, telling friends about them. So in the same way that you can network in the real world by sharing information, we can do the same thing online. So
Right.
obviously we're creative and we need to keep creating, even if we're not doing it in front of people. We're both staring at screens for hours every day now,
Yeah.
but we're doing it in a way that hopefully is creative. We're still talking about music, and I think people will be ready to hear us when it's safe to do so. I sure hope so.
Yeah. The videos we've been doing have just been a whole new source of inspiration just for my mind and giving me new stuff to work on. And it's been great. So I'm really glad that we're doing the stuff that we're doing.
Let's keep doing them. I mean, I'm enjoying this too, and I'm learning too. You're showing me some
Yeah.
things. So like I said, we're all works in progress, and there's always something to be learned from any other good musician, regardless of age and level of experience. But you've had plenty of experience playing already. So you definitely have some things to teach me too.
Well, that's nice of you to say. I appreciate that. The way I wanted to end this, I was wondering if I could just do like a quick round of just some kind of specific questions about certain things. I always like when people do this in interviews that I listen to. So if you want to just start out, if you don't have answers for all of them, that's fine. A lot of them are very specific. But if you could recommend 3 albums that everybody should listen to.
Mm-hmm. Any style of music or jazz? We're talking primarily.
I was going to ask later about some of your favorite non-jazz albums, maybe just for jazz. Yeah, specifically jazz.
Jazz. Okay. If someone said to me, so three are easy. If someone said to me, what's the best way to describe how guitar and piano can converse? I'd say, please listen to Undercurrent from Jim Hall and Bill Evans. Done in 1959, playing mostly, I think they're all standards actually, no originals, although they both composed well. That to me is such a beautiful example of how guitar and piano interact in a beautiful conversational way. So that record for sure. I'm going to stay with Jim Hall for a minute because I also love his Jim Hall live record. It
Oh,
was done
so
in the
good.
mid 70s with Don Thompson and Terry Clark. And that to me is the quintessential guitar trio record in terms of how they converse. So it's similar to the record with Bill in the sense it is very open, very conversational, but in this case it's bass and drums instead of guitar and piano. So those two for sure. A third record. Well, just about anything from Cannonball Adderley, but nothing comes to mind, although I love his
Oh,
playing
nice.
so much. Here's one more with Jim Hall on it that I like. I love Sonny Rollins playing from the early 60s in the bridge with Jim, Sonny Rollins, Bob Cranshaw, and Ben Riley. And that group played together for a while. And that's also a terrific record. I love Sonny's playing on that. And you can also see that group live on YouTube. There was a a columnist and a writer in San Francisco named Ralph Gleason, who did a series of black and white TV shows from San Francisco in the 60s called Jazz Casuals. You can see them all on YouTube. And Jim Hall is playing both with Art Farmer in that group. I think it was Steve Swallow on upright bass. Not sure who the drummer was. And also the group with that I just mentioned with Sonny Rollins, Ben Riley, and Bob Cranshaw. So you can see them playing live. So Jim Hall live, Undercurrent with Jim and Bill, and the Bridge with Sonny Rollins and Jim.
Nice. Yeah, I didn't know you were a big Cannonball Adderley guy. I went through like a Cannonball obsession when I was in college. I transcribed.
Oh,
like,
he's
all
one of
these
my
different
favorites.
solos. Yeah,
one of my
Cannonball
favorite
Takes
musicians.
Charge was my favorite album.
Incredible. So I have some funny stories about him. Actually, he was a teacher, and came up from Florida in his early 30s to New York and just blew everybody's mind because he was already playing beautifully. And I did one gig with Roy McCurdy in the early 80s at a little jazz festival on Vancouver Island. And Roy, I think, is still playing well in his late 70s. I saw some recent notices of him playing. Everybody says he sounds beautiful still. But he said Cannonball was such a great leader that very often people would stay with him for 10 years or more, because even in the 60s, this might have to do with his academic background, he was offering paid vacations and pension plans, and
Wow.
and he was really organized as a leader, and apparently a real pleasure to work for, and had wonderful groups. I think he kind of got taken for granted after a while, because maybe he was doing slightly more commercial stuff. But he, for me, especially some of the live records, had this beautiful way to take very accessible tunes and still had plenty of room to have long, extended blowing sections. He was such a lyrical, beautiful soloist and such a great singing tone. You tell it was him after about 1 minute. I think, what's the record he did with Bill Evans? That's a beautiful record, where they do Waltz for Debbie in 4.
Yeah.
Is it something new?
Is it called Know What I Mean?
I'm not sure if I know the title, if I heard it, Mike, but he did one record with Bill Evans where they play Waltz for Debbie in 4. And it's such a beautiful, he did a Brazilian record too, I think, with some Brazilians that I loved. And I'm ashamed to say, as much as I like his playing, I don't really know the names of many of his albums. Of course, I know his work with Miles. And he and Coltrane were kind of interesting foils because they were so different. I think Miles sort of enjoyed a little friendly competition between the two of them, having them both in the group. But he's one of my very favorite soloists.
Yeah, mine too. Easily one of my favorite alto players. Next one, what are 3 of your favorite classical pieces?
That's easy. Probably anything from Stravinsky. So eclectic. If I had to pick one of the ballets, the obvious one would probably be Rite of Spring, which caused a riot about 100 years ago, but still it sounds so amazing and fresh to me. There's some other ballets he did later that I like very much that are much more kind of legato sounding for chamber groups with strings. Apollo and Orpheus, both beautiful ballets too from Stravinsky. I love the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra. Probably any of the string quartets from Valery Debussy or Shostakovich. That's a lot more than 3. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of a dilettante with classical music. I've never studied a score, but I've listened enough that I have favorite composers and I can clearly recognize pieces, and I know some history and background about some of the men's lives who wrote some of this music. So I can probably think of 15 composers that I love, whose work I know well enough to recognize. But it's just kind of a fan's appreciation as opposed to any kind of in-depth study of the music. Mm-hmm. I've been limping through a little tiny bit of Bach's second violin partita, the little B minor, where you're going up and down the arpeggios. And that actually lays pretty well for a jazz guitarist. You can see all the tries lining up just as Bach played them, and there's some Lydian dominant ideas in there, and there's some tons of dominant altered sounds in there. And he wrote this in probably 1730 or 40. I had a great experience, actually. He was teaching for more than 20 years in a town called Leipzig. If you're German, you say Leipzig, in Eastern Germany. And the church where he taught and performed is still there, and it looks just like it did in 1740, Thomaskirche. Wow. And he's buried there. And you can go in every Friday to hear Bach for the equivalent of a couple of bucks. So I was right next door doing a workshop, and my friend told me about this. So I went in there, and out comes a 40-voice male choir and bass, bowed bass. And I'm hearing these glorious contrapuntal harmonies and thinking, Bach he's buried right in front of me there. And there's a pretty good chance that he wrote this and heard it played in the space. And it was pretty great to be there and hear it. It really was. Wild.
That sounds amazing. So just on the topic of 3 things, do you have 3 favorite standards that are not as commonly played by people?
Sure. Jerome Kern's last song, Nobody Else But Me. I'll play it for you sometime. It's the only tune I know that modulates from the key of C down a half step to the key of B at bar 5. When he modulates back up, it's seamless. That's a beautiful tune. It's his last tune. So Nobody Else But Me I like a lot. I like to play Everything I Love from Cole Porter with the Bill Evans changes, which I have, which I think maybe I shared with you, or I will if you'd like them. Another standard people don't play so much. Dream Dancing from Cole Porter. Nice one. So, I tell musicians, please keep learning songs. This is one way we can continue to improve. I mean, some musicians do just fine, and in some cases have very good careers playing the same repertoire of 20, 30 tunes. And they definitely can find new challenges, new ways to get through the songs to keep them fresh and interesting for them. But they're not particularly ambitious about learning new repertoire. I definitely don't learn a new tune every week or even every month. But at the end of the year, I want to have a few new things in my repertoire that I haven't played in a while. And I would argue that continuing to learn new tunes is a way to grow. I mean, improvising at the highest level is about being able to create beautiful melodies. So as we continue to learn beautiful melodies, all that gets kind of factored into our DNA about how we think not only about playing somebody else's melody, but how we construct our own melodies. And using the melody of the tune itself as a way to create context for your solo is also a way to grow. And every new melody has something in it that maybe helps you expand your sensibilities somehow, even if you don't know exactly how when you're learning it. Other composers that I like that are maybe not so often played, they're not strictly standards, but they kind of fall into that realm of repertoire. The Bill Evans tunes, he wrote about 60 songs. I only play 2 now, but I'm going to learn some more. And I just posted one on my channel that people like, Remembering the Rain, and I think I played for you. Fantastic ballad. I love Strayhorn's music. I played just a few of his, Rain Check, Upper Manhattan Medical Group, and Isfahan, but I'm going to learn some more of his. So my repertoire typically is not jam session repertoire. I wouldn't expect even an experienced player to necessarily know Dream Dancing or nobody else but me. I mean, there's some musicians who have kind of encyclopedic knowledge of tunes, but I'll know dozens or hundreds of tunes. And I know some of those folks. Some of them are guitar players. Howard Alden knows a ton of tunes. Jack Wilkins, my friend Sid Jacobs in LA, who are some others, many. But there's some guys who are very good musicians who really play the same 20, 30 tunes only. So I'm not knocking their choice, but I would argue that, considering this notion of keeping your repertoire expanding as part of your practice regimen is useful, I think. And you discover favorite composers. They could be, it's an old tune maybe that was written from the 30s or 40s, but it's new to you.
Yeah.
So
I love discovering new songs too. I love when I'm out at a gig or I'm hearing somebody and I hear a song that I really like. I'm just like, oh, what is that? And I write it down. I go check it out. I love that. And it, like you said, it just keeps expanding our knowledge of the music.
And good composers, in some cases, are very prolific and nobody's playing their tunes. So if you like Brazilian music, you're probably going to be playing songs from Jobim. And everybody, unless you're Brazilian, plays the same 5 songs from Jobim. Jobim alone wrote 400 songs. 400. I'm up to 12. The point being, with a teeny bit of homework, you can have a whole beautiful repertoire of obscure bossa novas. And I would argue that it's really okay to play unfamiliar music for an audience if it's beautiful, I think.
Right.
We can give them something familiar. Sure, play Wave or Girl from Ipanema if you want to. Those are nice songs. Ideally, listen to them singing the melodies in Portuguese so that you can phrase the way they phrase, because that's the charm of those tunes, I think, is the way they phrase in Portuguese, not English. So listen to them singing in Portuguese to get a notion of how the Brazilians think about rhythm, because it is special and unique. But why not play Caminhos Cruzados or Brigas Nunca Mais or Dutil Paisachim or Ligia or Luisa? Nobody plays those unless you're Brazilian, and they're fantastic tunes.
Yeah, and it's cool too because it shows you how the language that it's sung in could affect the articulation on the guitar and how you phrase the melody and stuff like that, which I feel like that's something that people don't typically think about very often. So that's a really interesting idea.
Oh, I encourage people, if you're playing a song that has a lyric, so someone has sung that melody, check out the people who sing the melodies because you're learning space, phrasing, and that can affect how you play the melody. To me, the melody is just as important and just as much an opportunity to be creative as the solo. Don't assume melody is just something to be gotten out of the way, and then the important part is the improvising, and then you don't ever reference the melody again until the end of the tune. Sing the melody while the solos are going. Think about the phrasing. The lyric might have a story that might somehow influence some of your harmonic choices in your solo. There's a funny story about Ben Webster in a recording studio playing a beautiful solo on a ballad. He stops in the middle, and the engineer says, "Ben, that was fantastic. Why did you stop?" "I forgot the lyric." Wow. For him, it was important to know the lyric while he was soloing. I forgot the lyric. And that may be a little urban legend.
Somebody like him.
Yeah. He was, especially the swing era players, although he he embraced a little bit of the bebop vocabulary too as he got a little older and interacted with some of the beboppers like Coleman Hawkins did too. But you hear this emphasis on melody and phrasing in a way that's a little different from the beboppers. It's less technical, although he had plenty of technique. It's really more about creating melodies, and that to me is what improvising should be.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's what all the study is for. And being able to interact with other players in a way that feels conversation and creating some synergy. We're creating together, really, and that's sort of a lifetime of refining the conversation, which I find pretty interesting.
Yeah, gives us an infinite number of things to always work on and be exploring, which music is the best.
I agree.
How about for non-jazz albums? You have a couple of favorite albums, any genre you want.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I'm really an authority on Indian music, but I've heard some amazing music from India. Obvious choice in terms of people who are well known here, people like Ali Akbar Khan, because he had a school for many years in California after he became famous in India and taught probably a couple of generations. He just passed away, I think, in maybe his early 90s on the sarod, incredible instrument that kind of sounds like the banjo meets the sitar. It's got a hide, animal hide stretched over a metal frame, and then a stainless steel fingerboard. So it almost sounds like a banjo and a sitar together. But I heard him in Portland once in the 70s. Amazing. So probably anything from him I'd like. Certainly of the current Indian masters, Zakir Hussain on tablas, just to watch the Indian players produce such amazing sounds on their instruments. So tablas, sarods, sitars, Ravi Shankar, obviously, those are the obvious choices. John McLaughlin has used a number of great Indian musicians in his Shakti project. That's a nice world music collaboration. So music from India I find very interesting. And I would say that the music from Brazil for sure. So that these all qualify as world music, not strictly jazz, although the Brazilian music obviously has a jazz component because many of the Brazilians, even going back to Jobim in the 50s, were listening to American jazz on the radio. And so they incorporated standard harmony into their tunes. From other parts of the world, I think probably every culture has something interesting. I'll tell you one quick story. Maybe 5-6 years ago, I was in Phoenix. I work there sometimes. And in a suburb, they have something called the Museum of Musical Instruments. It's the size of an aircraft hangar. It's huge, privately funded. And they organize the different continents by room. So you walk into a room that's the size of a basketball court, and you have all these display tables with maybe 10 or 12 instruments displayed on them beautifully with a flat screen TV. You walk up with a little listening device, and then you see people from that culture playing those instruments that are displayed in front of you. So I only just looked at Africa when I was there. That's all I had time for. I was there for an hour and a half or 2 hours just in Africa. So when you start in Southern Africa, it's somebody with a log and a little piece of wire stretched across it with a stick. And then you come up to the screen and you see this person singing and really making music with the log and the stick and the wire. And then as you move farther north, you start to see the European influences. And when you get up to North Africa and Morocco, you see all these incredible string orchestras, and they're all playing the violins in their laps like little basses. So they've invented their own technique to play the violins. But I think probably every country in Africa has some interesting folk traditions, I'm sure. And I think that's true also for Argentina, Brazil, probably every country in South America. I know a little bit of the music from Brazil. I've been many times to Argentina. So I'm not only familiar with tango, but chacarera and some of the other folkloric rhythms and traditions from Argentina a little bit. I don't really play into the music, but I've heard quite a bit of it. Tango, of course. So I think probably every culture has something interesting if you're open-minded to hear it. So probably, my little bit of sampling that I've had from music from Brazil, Argentina, India, and I wouldn't say I really have any really real exposure to the things in Africa other than my one day in the Museum of Musical Instruments. But I think probably every culture has something interesting to share.
Yeah, it's interesting too when you're looking into it because it makes you realize how young of a country America is and how young American music is compared to some of these other cultures.
Absolutely. I've heard a bit of music in China also, and that they have culture that goes back at least a couple of thousand years, and some of the instruments and some of their traditions are very evolved also. Quite beautiful.
Yeah, that's awesome. So this next question, this is a non-music question. This one might be a little bit tricky, but so you've traveled all over the world. Do you have a favorite place that you've traveled to if you had to pick one?
Hard to say. I mean, I've had so many good experiences, and every culture has something interesting. Not just one memorable gig. Well, one that was kind of historic, I met through my bassist friend David Friesen, the man that I came out to visit Portland with. He introduced himself in the early 80s to a man named Paul Horn, who started as a jazz player and then got into world music. And when David and I met him, David met him first. He was living in Canada and had landed immigrant status on Vancouver Island. And through his connection with an impresario in Toronto, Paul met a man who was bringing some Russian musicians and dancers to perform in Canada. And even though this was the height of, not the height of the Cold War, but definitely still the middle of the Cold War, there was still the Soviet Union. This is before the wall came down and everything changed in 89. This was 83. So Paul arranged a tour for us, David, Paul, and Paul's son Robin and myself, to go over to play in Russia. And in some cases, I think in Leningrad for sure, now it's called St. Petersburg again, that city's name has changed a few times. We were the first public performance in 1983 since Sidney Bechet in 1927. So people were really curious. People had been going over there to play probably since jazz had started, but these were primarily private concerts at embassies and consulates for folks who were either embassy staff or government officials. They were not for the public. So we had big audiences in all these places, and it felt kind of historic, and the people were very kind. And the thing that I had taken away from that, which I kind of expected, was that individual people have no difficulty separating out a one-to-one interaction with somebody when the two governments are hostile. So in Petersburg, actually, we were invited back to people's apartments, and I think maybe it's some risk to them. We might have even been followed, who knows. But we had long conversations and walking around St. Petersburg till 3 a.m. with our new friends. And I remember one time I was in a room with some friends in someone's apartment in St. Petersburg. And the one friend that had brought me over was the only one besides me who spoke English. And he said, okay, I'm leaving now. And I looked around at all these folks and realized I can't really talk to any of these people, but they're all smiling. So I just stayed, and we kind of pointed and looked at things. And we actually managed to communicate for another couple of hours with no common language between us, which was quite interesting. I still remember it was 1983. Actually, on my wall here, I've got 2 watercolors from one of the men whose apartment we spent time with. And he and his wife, not only, I think he'd already had the pictures done because when we met him, there wouldn't be time to paint anything for us. But he created these beautiful kind of tongue and groove frames, and he couldn't get them all finished. He wanted to give 2 to each one of us. So we had to go on to the next town. And he took an 11-hour train ride with all these heavy paintings and frames that he made with his wife to meet us and give us these paintings. And I still have them, these 2 watercolors from St. Petersburg. So that's typical of the kind of generosity sometimes you'll encounter. So that was a memorable trip. And the audiences were very attentive, very enthusiastic. But I think what I also discovered is that the size of the audience really is not important if it's a good audience. So I played for 5,000 people, and I played for one person on the couch. And honestly, you can have a real musical experience and a real exchange with a very small audience too. So, you know, of all the places I've played, I'm not sure if one stands out. Maybe that Russian trip, just from the standpoint of having some kind of historical importance, just for the Russian folks who hadn't heard any jazz. And I've been back to Russia 4 times since, which was a different experience because at that point the Soviet Union was gone, so it was a much more open society then. But those were good experiences too. I went back in the 90s, and then the last time was 2012.
That's amazing.
But you know, the beauty of this is the music is it's so specific to our culture, and yet it's a universal language because other musicians who like jazz have come either here to study or studied in their own country and then planted little seeds. So there is an appreciation for this music anywhere, and I think a good audience can recognize if you put your time in and have some experience playing something and or accomplish enough on your instrument to warrant their attention. It honestly doesn't matter what style you're playing, because I've heard music that I have no idea what I'm listening to in terms of the content, but you can tell when someone's accomplished. And so I think people appreciate a level of craft, even if they don't quite know what it is or they haven't heard it before. So certainly some of these Russian folks that we played for had never heard anything like it before, for sure.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome.
But they were open-minded, it was wonderful. And if someone said, let's go to Russia again, I'd go in a heartbeat. Mm-hmm. No plans to go, but I never say never.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I got 2 more for you. These are non-music things again. So this is kind of random. Do you have a favorite movie by any chance?
Yes. I mean, I'm a movie buff. Maybe you are too. Probably one of my favorite soundtracks, and my favorite film is Italian. There's an Italian director who's now done a pretty large body of work named Giuseppe Tornatore. And there's a film called, it looks like Cinema Paradiso, but if you say it in Italian, it's Cinema Paradiso. And he grew up as a young kid on an island. I don't think it was Sicily, but it was an island. And the film is roughly mirroring his life. So as a young kid, he loved movies, and they had a kind of a grumpy projectionist who would show the films. And he loved the movie, so he'd go all the time as a young kid, and he started bothering the projectionist to show him how to work the projector and how to make it work. And the projectionist was kind of grumpy and didn't really want to help him, but he sort of gradually endeared himself by bringing him lunch from his wife, and they gradually became friends. And then because the film in the movie, and probably, I'm not sure if this actually happened in the life of the director, but it could have, was very flammable. And at one point, if the film gets stuck during a showing of a film and it catches fire, so the young kid races up and pulls the older projectionist out and saves his life, basically. So now the projectionist, though, is blind. So the young kid becomes the projectionist. And then if the film skips ahead to him as a young man going off and leaving to join the army, and the film jumps around between him as a young kid, him as a young adult, and ultimately leaving now, and then him as a successful film director in Rome, finding out that the projectionist has died and he hasn't been back to the island in 30 years, so he goes back. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful, touching film. So it's the only film I own, actually. And the score was from Ennio Morricone, who did all the spaghetti westerns with Clint Eastwood, and it's a memorable soundtrack. It's just filled with beautiful melodies. And if you haven't seen that film, I would really recommend it.
And what's the title again, just for everyone listening?
It looks like cinema, but the Italians pronounce C as CH. So if you were pronouncing it in English, it looks like Cinema Paradiso. And if you're Italian, you say Cinema Paradiso. And Tornatore has done some other really nice films too, but that one in particular, that's the first one of his I saw, and I truly loved it, and I still do.
Do you have a favorite director?
I sure like him. Yeah, I mean, I like all the American directors that everybody likes, probably. Certainly Scorsese is still doing great work. What ones that I like? George Clooney has actually done a couple of nice films as a director. He did Good Night and Good Luck about Edward R. Murrow with David Strathairn as Edward R. Murrow, and George Clooney's in it. Terrific film. Other directors that I look for. Yeah, there are some I like. I like a lot of Clint Eastwood's work. Some people took issue with Bird, but I think that was actually some truth in that in terms of his portrayal of jazz and Charlie Parker. Some folks kind of felt it dwelled a little too much on the drugs, but I felt like there was some truth in that film, and he's done a lot of good movies. Ben Affleck has actually directed 2 films now that I like. He did one about the Iranian hostage situation that I liked a lot, and he did one called The Town about a bunch of bank robbers in a neighborhood in Boston. He directed and starred in it. Quite good. So some actors can make very good directors. Robert Redford's directed some nice films. What else do I like as a director?
Have you seen Whiplash?
I didn't see it only because everyone gave it such negative reviews, and it's just to me it sounds complete. Absolutely. Although I like J.K. Simmons as an actor.
Oh, he's amazing.
Completely, yeah, but it sends the wrong. I mean, from what I heard about the film, it just sends the wrong message to musicians about what music is.
Right, and there's like a big disconnect too, because people that don't know anything about jazz and jazz school and just jazz music in general, they watch that movie and they think it's incredible, And the one good thing that I will say has come out of it is I did have a couple of younger students who were more rock guitar players, and then they see that movie and it actually made them want to try to play jazz. So that was probably the one positive thing I could say that came out of that movie. But from seeing it, I mean, it's everything that you've heard from everybody. I mean, it's completely unrealistic and just horrible depiction of going to school for jazz.
Yeah, and the idea of a teacher being a drill sergeant and pummeling your students into submission and having them quake in terror, that's the wrong message,
Right.
Although J.K. Simmons is quite a good actor.
Yeah.
And I also like Miles. Who's the young actor who plays the drummer? Miles. He's quite a good young actor. I can't remember his last name. Do you recall the actor in the lead? Miles.
I know. Yeah, I know who you're talking
about.
Quite good.
I forget. He's quite good, and he's done a number of other films. He's quite good.
Mm.
But I love film, so I could probably watch a movie every night, and sometimes I do.
What do you do, streaming? Because you said you only own one movie.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just got cable down here, so I have just basic. So I got a few non-subscription HBO networks and Epic and the Movie Channel, so no problem watching movies. It's not all first-run stuff, but I do try to keep up.
Awesome. And then the last one, do you have a favorite book? Or some authors or favorite books?
Yeah, I mean, I am reading in general quite a bit. I'm actually just finishing up. I wouldn't call it a favorite book, but it's fun. Edith Wharton, The Age of Innocence, is about a 100-year-old book, and it's actually quite good. Authors that I've liked lately that I enjoy. That's a hard one. I mean, I've read all kinds of stuff all over the map, everything from things 100 years ago to current stuff. I remember there are quite a few books of John Irving's I like. There's one in particular, two in particular I like from him: The World According to Garp and Prayer for Owen Meany. He's probably written a dozen books, some of which I like very much. Those two for sure. Other favorite authors. That would be a hard one, but I generally make a habit to read probably for anywhere from 20 minutes to half an hour before I go to bed every night. I've done it for years. So I'm a slow reader, but I'm always reading something.
Do you prefer fiction or nonfiction?
I'm generally fiction, although I like some of the bio books. I particularly like some of the jazz bio books. Some of them are quite good, actually. I'd recommend the Gary Burton one, Learning to Listen. He's quite a good writer. And, a parade of great guitar players have gone through his group. So from our standpoint, it's entertaining reading. So some of the jazz autobiographies are quite good.
Yeah, I mean, Miles Davis, that's the classic one that everyone goes to. But when I first read that one blew my mind because it's just such a firsthand experience of them really, talking to him and hearing everything he had to say about all these different musicians.
Yeah, I think some of Miles' bluster was a bit of insecurity and shyness. So he put up this really tough exterior shell to kind of keep people away, because I think he was a little insecure and a little shy. So he created this bad boy image. And that doesn't really justify his treatment of women, unfortunately. But, I think if he knew you and liked you, it was probably great fun to be around. Dave Liebman had some nice stories about him.
Yeah, that's awesome. That pretty much covers everything I wanted to ask you. I mean, thank you so much for doing this. This was incredibly informative. I think everybody that's listening is really going to enjoy this. And I'm going to put your link to your YouTube channel in the description. And I'll also put it in the comments and I'll pin it so everybody can see it. So everybody, please make sure you subscribe to John's YouTube channel. And yeah, hopefully we can do another one of these soon. We have a couple of master classes in the works that are going to be coming out relatively soon, hopefully. And yeah, thanks again, John. I really appreciate this.
This was great talking to you, Mike, and I look forward to more collaborations online. Thanks so much for giving me a plug. I really appreciate it.
Yep, sounds good. All right. Thanks again, John. Take care.
You too.